Blog Talk Radio, the world's largest online radio network.
And this is Ed Shapiro.
On Going Out of Your Mind.
And we all need to go out of our mind at least once a day.
And then we'll maybe be able to come to our senses. Today's guest is Marianne Williamson, who we adore, and as I'm sure many of you do too. She's been a leading light for those seeking greater awareness for many, many years. 4 of her 10 books have been #1 New York Times bestsellers, and published over 20 years ago. Her book, A Return to Love, is considered a must-read by millions of people.
And it's so perfect. It's so perfect. A book like Return to Love. And Marianne, explain to us.
She's going to be here and just joining us in 1 second. She's deeply committed to both spiritual practice and to spiritual activism. And Marianne is now bringing an essential awareness, especially at this time, to the need to bring together consciousness and politics. And this is a subject often considered taboo in spiritual circles. So we're hoping and welcoming Marianne will be able to explain this for us. Welcome, Marianne. Hello? Oh, hello, Marianne.
She's here. I know she's here.
Well, surely she's here. No, it doesn't look like she is.
But I guess she's going to be here any second.
We're just waiting for her to come online.
But it's important for us to say how she affects us. We've done a couple of books with Marianne Williamson. We did a book called Voices from the Heart with President Gorbachev, with Bishop Tutu, with some of the great thinkers, and she's here now.
Okay. Hi, is this Marianne?
Yes, it is.
Oh, hi there.
I'm so sorry. I had called and you couldn't hear me and I could hear you, and I think I pushed the wrong button, so I'm so sorry.
That's quite okay.
But that's understandable because I know that we're on other sides of the world. That's how amazing it is.
Where are you,
actually? We can
actually?
talk to each other like this and come together in love.
Right. Where are you guys?
We're in Colorado, near Aspen.
Well, I'm in Los Angeles. It's not exactly the other side of the world, but
it's close. A different universe.
Well, I say that because when we come together like this, it feels very far away, but yet so close.
Right.
So, Marianne, I was just introducing you, and particularly how consciousness and politics, it's a subject, a combination that's often considered taboo in spiritual circles.
Right.
Well, you've crossed that line. Tell us about it.
Well, to me, there's not a line. In many religious traditions, tonight is the beginning of Yom Kippur, for instance. In Judaism, the notion of tikkun olam, to repair the world, that is part of our spiritual mission. And in Protestantism and Catholicism, there are many religious traditions where the idea of social justice activism is very much core to the religious traditions. That's actually true in Islam as well. In the higher consciousness movement, the spiritual movement that you and I, many of us, have been involved in the last few years, it is true that it developed in a very apolitical way. A little strange to me, because when my career first started, from the very beginning, I was very involved in the AIDS community, mainly because gay men in Los Angeles pretty much gave me my career. So I was not only...
You and
yes, and then she actually was very active when the suffering began and when the crisis emerged. I remember that. But so for me, human suffering was up close and personal as part of the work and the spiritual practice from the beginning. But then as things moved forward in the New Thought movement, et cetera, it was very apolitical and even used what seems to me a kind of ersatz version of spirituality, almost a counterfeit version of enlightenment, as it were, to give oneself a path, to say, well, because the spiritual realm is a realm of abstraction, and the mortal realm is a realm of illusion anyway, we best not be involved, and politics is so toxic and so dirty and so angry, and on a spiritual path, that's everything we're trying to get away from. Well, the problem there is but that puts you in a real conundrum, of course, because spirituality is a path of the heart. It's a path of love. And if you're on a path of love, you cannot turn away from a suffering child. You cannot turn away from a starving person. You can't turn away from suffering. Suffering of all sentient beings, compassion for the suffering of all sentient beings is absolutely core to any higher religious teaching. So I understand why sometimes we turn away from anything that is toxic and corrupt in the world. But in some areas of darkness in the world, our point is to engage it, because what you don't engage, you can't transform. And that which we engage from a higher place, we ultimately help to transform forever.
I had a teacher who used to say it's like turning shit into gold.
Well, that's certainly one way to put it.
But Marianne, why now? You in November you're doing this wonderful event in LA called Sister Giant.
Sister Giant.
And your whole purpose right now is this coming together and bringing consciousness into politics, and also encouraging women to be more involved. Why now?
Well, I think why now? Because the red lights are absolutely blinking. The buzzers are sounding. The probability vectors for the next 20 years are extraordinarily grim, not just in our country, but around the world. Here in the United States, we have a 23.1% child poverty rate, which among 35 developed nations in the world, our child poverty rate is second only to Romania. We have an incarceration rate in the United States, which is not only higher than any other country, but the highest in the world in history. And we have what I believe are direct threats to democracy, such as the Citizens United Supreme Court decision that has basically given permission to corporate as well as union interests to give anonymous, unlimited donations towards political advocacy. So I think that people who are involved in the spirituality and higher consciousness movement are the last people who should be sitting this out. We have unique gifts to give. We have unique contributions to make because we understand the kind of rethinking that is necessary. We understand the kind of return to first principles that is necessary in order to bring an individual life out of crisis and back into regrowth, and all that a nation is a collection of individuals.
But it's so insane that they should say that corporations are people, and there has to be something that cuts through. I mean, the beauty and the exquisiteness of who you are and other women, like Oprah Winfrey that I know you work with, and I know you even have worked with Elizabeth Taylor. So many amazing people who know that this is a time we need to bring in the feminine. We need to bring in the whole consciousness, the goddess consciousness, because I think it feels like women seem to have much more going for themselves than men. We need to come together at this time. Why don't you run for office? I mean, I hope I'm not saying the wrong thing, but with your brain, everyone should have a brain like you and would have a real world.
Well,
would you consider that?
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I think what I'm feeling moved to do right now is, everything begins with a conversation, as you well know, and you yourselves are leaders in this. We need a new conversation in the United States in order to awaken some energy so that we're not just dealing with these forces that are always pulling us down into apathy and cynicism and anger. Once this occurs, once we lift up the energy, once we move out of the complacency that so bogs many of us down, then I think many of us will be thinking, as I am and as I'm sure you are, and I'm sure everybody listening on this program is, what is the best contribution I can make? What is the next step that I could take that would be the highest contribution? For myself right now, I feel if I just ran for political office, like what, within the system as it is, I feel the same kind of disinterest in the system as it is that everybody else I know feels. What I'm interested in at this point is the creation of a new conversation and a new political dynamic. And I think in that place, a lot of people, perhaps myself included, I don't know, might be thinking in terms of whether or not we might run for office, but we don't want to feed into the system as it is now. And that's why Sister Giant, for men as well as women, by the way, has to do with asking ourselves, can we remain true to our spiritual convictions and still engage in politics? Can we go there without...
Why not have sister giant, brother giant?
Well, I think one day we will, actually. I would think that would be the
Sorry to
next
interrupt you, but
indicated action. No,
Yeah.
I do. The only problem is, this is the issue. In the U.S. Congress, fewer than 17% of our elected representatives are women. Fewer than 17%. On the level of state legislature, fewer than 24% are women. So dealing with the gender equity issue among our elected representatives seems very important to me. It's not that the Sister Giant weekend is only for women. It's not. But I felt it would be false advertising to not make it clear that there will be a lot of conversation at that weekend that has to do with the specific and specifically unique emotional and psychological, even spiritual issues that I think women face when we even ask ourselves if we'd be interested in running for office. You know, it's interesting, statistically, if a man is running against a woman in a political campaign, statistically, the electorate is willing to vote for a woman. That's not where the withhold is. The problem is that women are not running. And we're not running, certainly myself, and I think a lot of people, because of all the things that we've already said. It goes against everything that the sensitive heart. It goes against everything we're trying to be in our lives. So I believe that women have a role to play in recreating the political dynamic, in putting forth a vision of America and the world in which humanitarian values are seen as our operating principle rather than economic values. But ultimately, that's not a man or woman's conversation. That has to do with something, a new evolutionary plateau inside all of us, whether we're male or female. So men are absolutely welcome to come to Sister Giant, and I hope that they do.
Why do you feel women seem to be more, or feel that they are more powerless where politics and change is concerned?
Well, I think statistically, historically, we have been. You know, it's very interesting, Deb, and we all know this as individuals. You know, sometimes you make a move, you make a developmental change, there's a developmental shift in your life that is materially true before you are ready and able to psychologically and emotionally inhabit the new space. It takes you a while to get to where you are. And I think that that's true for groups of people as well as individuals. So it's like we have a lot of power. I'm not saying that women haven't come a long way. I mean, is every battle won? No. But have we come a long way, particularly in countries like ours? Absolutely. But we do not yet have, and I think this is always true. You could say it about African Americans. You could say it about gay people. It's often true that we don't have the emotional and psychological habits of power. So we have more power than we yet have the psychological, emotional habits of using. And I think among women, we had to spend so many years centered in a conversation of how do we get power that we haven't fully shifted into, now that we have the power we have, what are we going to do with it? A fully empowered American womanhood, I do not believe, would tolerate the fact that we have 23.1% of our children living in child poverty. A fully empowered American womanhood, I don't think would tolerate the fact that 17,000 children on this planet die of starvation every day. But it's like, once again, and you see this in an individual life too, I know I have, it's like you're not yet fully grown into the power or the responsibility that you already have. I mean, don't you think so?
I agree, and it just saddens me when I see, as you put it, the disproportion in politics, the disproportion in so many areas where the male power structure, and they're not that particularly, they don't use power in a particularly good way, and yet they're so dominant.
You see, what it is in yoga, for instance, and I don't go through all these different yoga things. There's things that are good, but using it as a system, the chakra system, like they call it the third chakra, which is the navel area, is the ego, is the power. And what happens is we want to survive, we have a good life, but then the power is so powerful for men. They have such a strong ego, and it's a power thing that they want to dominate others. Women have compassion. The nature in women generally is more compassionate. The nature in men is to dominate. That's why corporations and so many of these different people have that problem.
You know, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. I think that for myself, because the ego mind is present in all of us, whether it's male or female. Some of the most powerfully feminist thinkers I've known have been men. I think if we're honest with ourselves, a woman can be a real jerk as much as a man can be. Sometimes you see women getting into positions of power and exercise that power with as much patriarchal ardor and domineering spirit as any man. I think it's kind of you as a man to say those things, but I think if we're honest with ourselves, it's not men who are keeping us from running for office. And I think also, Deb, you and I, you know, many of us remember a time like the 1970s, the feminism of the 1970s, when the ideal of female empowerment was absolutely inseparable from the notion of sisterhood. It was absolutely understood that none of us were getting there unless all of us got there. And I have to tell you, I see a lot of stuff among women right now where the empowerment issue is on the table, but not the sisterhood. And I think that any woman who's honest with ourselves, we know that some of the work we have to do is to deal in ourselves and among ourselves how we as women treat other women. I can't say that more men have held me back in my life than more women have. I can't honestly say that. Now, I know that the main person who has held me back in my life, to whatever extent I've been held back, has been Marianne Williamson. But to the extent to which other people have been involved, I can't honestly say it's been more men than women. We all have the darkness of the heart.
Well, that's true, but I noticed that Shane, our producer, he just brought to mind something that's very important, which is actually the coming together of the masculine and feminine, the embracing of both that could actually change the world.
Well, I think that's it. You know, Germaine Greer, the famous Australian feminist, said the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy, but fraternity. I mean, this is not about let's change, you know, men running the world for women running the world. It's all of us together. That's all we're talking about, even in the political system. We're talking about gender equity here. We're not talking about going into a situation that is imbalanced in the direction of women as it is now imbalanced in the direction of men. And once again, it's not men, it's women choosing not to run. So, you know.
So let's just come back for a moment to what your whole work at the moment is in terms of bringing consciousness into politics. And even certainly with the election coming up now, this is a perfect time to discuss this, in as much as politics does not seem to have any consciousness around it at all. And the fighting, the infighting, and the self-centeredness and the power-hungry greed is just staring us in the face.
And the Senate doesn't even know how what rape can do to you. I mean,
exactly. I mean, all these ridiculous notions. And yet, how do we begin to bring more consciousness into that?
Well, it's, as we know, we have a system of government at this time that is dominated by two major political parties. George Washington, when he, in his farewell address, warned us about political parties. There's nothing in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence that says that two major political parties will have a chokehold on the political dialogue. And when you look at the larger narrative of American political history, third parties have been extremely important. The Abolitionist Party brought us abolition. The Suffragette Party brought us suffrage. The Socialist Party brought us Social Security. Now, when you have the whole system of democracy, we have a difference here between politics and democracy. Politics is boring, and it's tight, and it's locked up. Democracy itself is exciting. In politics, very, very little can happen. In democracy, anything can happen. And the whole idea of democracy is that the better angels of our nature have a chance to step forward and be heard. So when we're talking about higher consciousness, you know, the American people, I believe, we're on the move. People are fine. The issue is that in American politics today, the best that we have to offer is not allowed to move through. The most creative thinking, the most exciting possibilities, the higher consciousness ways in which people would come together and say, we can have a world that works. We can have a world that works for everyone, in which there is not this immense amount of human suffering. Because, you know, if we talk about higher consciousness, once again, you cannot separate a higher consciousness conversation from the conversation that addresses unnecessary human suffering, whether it's child poverty, a high incarceration rate, the extraordinary peril of our environmental situation today, the extraordinary and unnecessary militarism of so much of American foreign policy. These are issues that have to do with our asking ourselves, is this really what love would do? And right now, because of the extraordinary domination of moneyed interests, particularly now with Citizens United, on two major political parties that have this chokehold on the system, people, in order to run and in order to stay in office, are absolutely bound to cater to the moneyed interests which both put them there and keep them there. So within that current situation, I mean, with all due respect, do you hear Barack Obama or Mitt Romney talking about the child poverty rate? Do you hear either one of them talking about the incarceration rate? Do you hear either one of them talk about these issues of major and extraordinary human suffering that are like elephants on the table? So I think that one of the reasons Sister Giant is scheduled for 3 days after the presidential election is because right now we need to get through this election. For myself, I'm hoping very much that Mr. Romney does not become our next president. That's just my personal view.
Could he possibly be?
Well, the reason Romney could become the next president, this is just my opinion. I'm very concerned about the fairness of our elections. I'm very concerned about our machines. I'm very concerned. We had a major presidential election, I believe, in the year 2000, in which basically the election was stolen. And that's my belief. And that's what concerns me. I'm very concerned about Election Day, voter suppression, et cetera. But no matter who wins, we have a lot to talk about.
If I could just come in here for a moment.
Yeah.
If I could just say, I mean, the depth of problems that we're facing, the issues around elections and around the country, it makes me wonder, is it really feasible to think in terms of change that could actually work?
But isn't that what every addict says to themselves? Isn't that what everybody whose life is in crisis says? Why even bother? I'm going down. Why even bother?
You are so beautiful.
Beautifully put.
You are so beautiful, Marion, and your voice is so soothing and healing. And I know light has to overwhelm. Light is stronger than dark, and I know that light has to win. And may we all understand that we should vote, let other people vote, and let the goodness come in because, gosh, we really need it.
So having said that, we're actually going to take a very short commercial break here. We are listening to Going Out of Your Mind. Marianne Williamson is our guest.
And this is Ed and Deb Shapiro.
We'll be right back. So we're talking with Marianne Williamson. This is Ed and Deb Shapiro, Going Out of Your Mind. And I just want to quote from Marianne something that she said in talking about Sister Giant, her new project, that Albert Einstein said we would not solve the problems of the world from the same level of thinking we were at when we created them, that we need to shift from economics to humanitarian values as the organizing principle of human civilization. And I mean, as forward thinkers, yes, the idea of humanitarian principles is just heavenly. And I'm wondering if that you actually envision that happening, Marianne.
Well, if you think about some of the more heinous ideas that do dominate politics and human affairs today, they began with someone saying them. They began with someone simply saying, this is how I see the world. I mean, so much of what happens in the world today is hatred expressed. You know, I've never heard about a kind of sort of sometimes casually, when it's convenient, committed terrorist. Terrorists are very obviously committed and have proved in horrific ways that they will do whatever it takes to effectuate their worldview. And even, I think, hatred has a perverse kind of courage. Now, on the other hand, I think many people, and I would consider myself among them at certain times in my life, have been kind of casually, when it's convenient, casually committed to love. So what you have is you have a relatively few people in the world whose hearts are really filled with hatred. And you have many, 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 many more people who are decent human beings just trying to make their way in the world. What's happening, however, is that those who hate with conviction. And whether it's a collective situation or an individual, the lesson to us here is that we need to step up the love. We can't just talk about it. We can't just apply it to our own lives. For those of us in the spiritual, taking a spiritual journey, it can't just be about me. It can't just be about love fixing my life, freeing me in my own personal life, or even freeing two of us together in our own relationships. If we look at Gandhi and we look at Dr. King, what they talked about was how love can heal political and social relationships as well. So when you ask me, can it happen? Well, ask Gandhi that. Ask Martin Luther King that. You know, Gandhi and King didn't just talk about the nonviolence in the heart of every man, woman, and child. They stood on that philosophy as a political philosophy, and they were not only profound as they did so, they were profoundly successful as they did so. So this is not, you know, some people would say, oh, this is just naive, you know, this idea that we can learn to live like brothers and we can address the care of our children and the educating of our women and creating cultural opportunities for women and taking care of large groups of desperate people around the world, knowing that it's a national security risk if we do not, that out of large groups of desperate people inevitably emerge all kinds of collective pathologies. But some people would say, oh, that's just a pipe dream, it's naive. I believe, and I think many of us believe if we think about it, that what's naive is to think that the human race will survive another 100 years if we do not make these fundamental changes.
Oh, yes, you're so true. Oh, you are so right. People just take it for granted. It's amazing. They think it's their birthright, and everything and everybody will take care of them, and everything's going to work out okay, and it doesn't matter who wins.
And you're absolutely right, and it's not this democracy of ours is not a guarantee, and more human survival is not going to be considered a guarantee if we continue the direction that we're in.
This is the most important time.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that beautifully because, as you said, Marianne, you know, as we've all said, we take everything so much for granted. And what you're saying is don't take it for granted. Nothing is guaranteed, and unless we make really important changes, it won't last. It won't continue.
And it's interesting because Deb, her grandfather was the editor for Winston Churchill.
And
she grew up in all that.
What now? You were what with Winston Churchill?
He was the editor. He helped write his speeches.
Your father?
And his books and everything.
My grandfather.
You're kidding.
Deb's grandfather also wrote the Charles Dickens Encyclopedia. Deb's British.
That's a little irrelevant, but
she only became an American citizen a year ago.
It's interesting for me, coming from England, in terms of the different type of political system that we have there to what we have here. And I'm not saying that either is better in terms of consciousness, but maybe it's a little fairer in terms of representation and standing up for people's rights.
I think it's absolutely fairer, including the public funding of the campaigns. Your political system is not dominated by money like ours is.
Yeah, they're only allowed a certain amount of money, and they only have 6 weeks to do it in.
Absolutely.
And then, more importantly, I feel, is that the government is actually made up of elected members. It's you can't just make a government up of ordinary people who haven't been elected and therefore don't represent the people. And so by having a government that represents everybody, it's kind of fairer.
Well, I don't know. That issue to me is a little bit of apples and oranges when you're talking about cabinet members because they're appointed by the president and so forth. But it's more the money that dominates the system through Citizens United and so forth. The extraordinary way that our government of the people, by the people, and for the people really has become over the last few decades a government of a few of the people, by a few of the people, for a few of the people. We've just been shoveling over the last few decades. We've been shoveling the major material resources of our country out of the hands of the many and into the hands of the few. And that's just simply the fact.
And it's such an idiot thing that happens in America, maybe all over the world, that people believe if they have billions of dollars, if they have the tons of money, they have to be smarter. They have all what it takes because everybody wants money. Everybody wants everything that the rich have, so therefore they should rule.
What's sad is how many people who do not have money agree with that.
Exactly.
And the whole notion of American democracy was to be that we do not believe in an aristocracy, because that's basically an aristocratic worldview. Theoretically, American democracy was based on the idea that it didn't matter where you came from, and it wouldn't matter how much money you had, and it didn't matter what your education was. If you have a free press so that you get your information, you have free public education so you have educated critical thought processes, that your native intelligence and your conscience and your deep reflection would be the force depended upon to govern a great nation. And what's so sad is...
It's so interesting you should say that.
Yeah.
Because you and Deb and I and Shane have a friend named Zoe Tryon with Aristocracy, and she's the goddaughter of Prince Charles, and she's there in Ecuador working with the poorer than the poor to help them with oil, and you and her are good friends.
Yeah, she's a wonderful woman, isn't she?
She's so beautiful, and she loves you so much.
She's one of those rare ones.
She's really great. I found it interesting what you were saying, Deb, about your grandfather. You know, my favorite reading is biographies after the spiritual things I read. But I love reading biographies, and one of the things that's so fascinating when you read biographies is that you do understand that it's the movements in history, one person who happened to do something or another person who happened to not do something, that made all the difference for millions of people ultimately. And I think it's very inspiring to me, but it's also a very cautionary tale. You know, I was just reading the story of Cleopatra. Well, the Ptolemaic dynasty had lasted for centuries. Nobody thought that was going to end. Rome, for that matter. You know, we act in America like, oh, this thing will just keep going. When historically,
that's
a
so
couple hundred
Marianne.
years is nothing.
It's so true. And people are, right now we're in such a dangerous place. I mean, it's so joyful and it's so inspiring to talk to you and have, when I watch people like you, and I must admit, Jon Stewart or Bill Maher, or you see some of these minds that are saying, hello, people, wake up, because it ain't going to be too easy if you don't do the right thing.
Yeah, but the exciting thing is, I think, and I would assume you think so too, how many of us are agreeing on the idea that there must be another way and are looking on finding that other way. I mean, you see it everywhere. You see it in religion and spirituality. You see it in business. You see it in education. You see it in so many of the things that you guys talk about and write about all the time, that I think about and write about all the time, that so many people listening right now are involved in. In almost every field of endeavor, there is an evolutionary push occurring in which people are saying, no, we don't have to do it the old way. We can do it a new way. And it has to do with a more heart-centered approach to life. And now we simply have to deal with this last bastion of holdout. You know, politics is still an area where it's a holdout for a very old and increasingly obsolete worldview. And, when we crash through this barrier and we take our consciousness into politics, I think it will be an extraordinary tipping point and an extraordinary historical change
really,
that can happen.
It's so true.
And as you said, we need only look at people like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and even Nelson Mandela, who have been able to really turn around through their individual efforts.
Absolutely.
And I really wanted to come back to what you were talking about with them, and particularly Gandhi and Martin Luther King, was the use of the word love.
Right.
Which is so, especially in politics, is a, not allowed sort of thing. It's just not usually put the two words together. And your ability, as in your books and your teachings, to use that word and to really encourage others to just start living with love instead of denying it.
It's so true, and it is very unfortunate what you said. It's almost like if you talk about love, you're branded a lightweight thinker. If you talk about love, you are trivialized and you are marginalized. Meanwhile, we have a whole political movement that is hatred expressed. So if you think about it, the only thing that could possibly triumph over that would be a political movement in which love is expressed. And that is how Martin Luther King described Gandhi. He said that he moved love beyond mere personal interaction and turned it into a large-scale social force for good. Martin Luther King was not branded a New Age nutcase, but he matched his talks about love and his commitments about love with political and strategic savvy. And that's what we need to do now. Those of us in the higher consciousness community must stop allowing ourselves to be infantilized by refusing to take on the serious issues of our day. We should be the last people sitting out the serious political and social questions. We should be the first person in there saying, wait a minute, take care of the babies, take care of the suffering, and where is the love?
Well, as you say, and I'm going to quote from you again, these are very serious times, and serious people need to be doing some serious thinking. The last thing we should do is allow ourselves to be infantilized by a counterfeit version of enlightenment. That I adore, the counterfeit version of enlightenment. No true search for enlightenment ignores the suffering of other sentient beings.
Well, like I said, how can we stand here while 23.1% of American children live in poverty? And that's extraordinary. And, of course, that's connected to our high incarceration rate. I'm sorry?
How can we separate that from our spiritual practice or our spiritual journey?
Absolutely.
That's the question that I find so fascinating, that we think of spirituality as this separate thing and don't realize that it's an integral part of every single breath we take.
Get off the mat and into the world.
Right. Sean Korn has done a wonderful video endorsement of Sister Giant, and she and I have increasingly worked together. She's great, isn't she? I love her.
Oh, I love Sean. She's like my darling little gorgeous one.
So, I think that many people have separated the conversation about love from the conversation about politics. But if you look at Gandhi and you look at King, you realize that separating the two is the aberration. And it's simply time to bring back together two of the most powerful forces in the universe, and that is the love in our hearts with collective action.
Can you just tell us your website so how people can
find you
and read more?
Thank you. The website is sistergiant.com or www.sistergiant.com. And the weekend will be November 10th and 11th, 2012. That's just 4 days after the presidential election. As I said before, no matter who wins, we need to talk. And I hope that people, it's a nonprofit event, so, I'm asking a suggested donation of $50, $25 for students. And if people can't pay that, pay what they can. You can go onto the registration page and see. And I hope that people will come to Los Angeles, because there will be something so extraordinary about people being there from all over the country. If you look on the website under the registration nav, where it says, look who's coming in from where, you see a map. We already have 39 states represented. So it's going to be I think the atmosphere will be so crackling, And then, but people who absolutely can't make it to LA or don't feel moved to do that can also attend via live streaming.
That's what I was going to ask. So we'll be on live streaming.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And we're doing this in association with the campaign school, Women's Campaign School of Yale University. So I'm not saying that any woman is or man is supposed to run for office, but I want people that weekend to be exposed to what it's about, so that we're not ignorant. I always say that I know two categories of people, right? I know people who are very involved in politics and they're very sophisticated and intellectual and they understand what politics is about, but they're just babies, if even that, on the spiritual journey, right? Mm-hmm. And then I know other people who are really advanced, certainly intermediate at least. We've been working for years on the spiritual journey and the internal development of self. And yet, have been so separated from any kind of political conversation or turned off to it or for whatever reason disconnected from it, right? Well, I have said often that it would take me years to really, be able to work with some of these, savvy political types to teach them much about the spiritual journey. That takes years. But I feel with some of these spiritual types, give me a weekend and I can tell you almost everything you need to know.
Oh, true.
So your intention in doing this is to inspire people to be leaders?
I think that we are leaders. I don't think we need to become leaders. I think we need to remember that in a democracy, the citizen is the leader. The government works for us. And I think that just that, a miracle is a shift in perception. That tweaking right there, it's all in our minds. We've allowed ourselves to become spectators. We have allowed ourselves to become disengaged. And that is that is the death of democracy, because those forces that would seek to dismantle the fundamentals of democracy have a pretty easy time doing so when the people who are the citizens don't even totally relate fully and fundamentally to what democracy is. So I want people to leave that weekend feeling that they are grounded enough in the political conversation, but not having felt that they left their spiritual center at the door, but rather that they stood that weekend both on their spiritual principles and on a higher level of political understanding. And that when they leave there that day, they may or may not feel like, yeah, I might run for school board one day, or I might run for state legislature one day, or I might run for Congress one day. It's none of my business whether or not people feel moved to take that kind of a step, but I want people to leave there saying, yeah, I might. If I feel like it, I will, because it is no longer such an unbelievable stretch to even imagine it. They've been informed enough, they've been engaged enough, that they sit more powerfully within themselves in that place called not only global spiritual citizen, but American citizen as well, and all that entails in terms of both power and responsibility.
I could listen to you all night long.
I pretty much do listen to you guys.
I'm feeling
what?
I said I do listen to you guys. I feel I read you and I listen to you.
I just love you so much.
What I'm feeling you're doing, Marianne, then in a way is sort of taking what most of us feel is our spiritual journey and actually saying, look, it applies to everything you do. And if you feel this love in your life and you feel this spiritual awareness in your life, then how does it apply to every single thing that you're doing?
And that is it in a nutshell. I mean, how can you talk about love but not apply that to economics? How can you talk about love but not apply that to politics? How can you talk about love and apply it only selectively?
Now I have two gurus, Marianne and Deb.
There you go.
That's a pretty cool threesome. Thank you for inviting me in.
We love you.
It's something, too. I guess you're talking my language here, because it's something I've always felt, from a very early age. I used to go to all the Ban the Bomb marches in England. Sometimes it meant traveling a few hundred miles, but hundreds of people gathering together to protest the bomb. This is in the 70s, I guess. It was just such a wonderful experience to feel that what I believed, what I felt so deeply could actually manifest in all these people together.
Deb, you're talking to something very important. I think that there's been a real revisionism in history over the last few years. And people look at us, people like yourselves and myself, for whom the formative years were the 1960s and the 1970s. And there is this idea that we were a little bit hippy-dippy, and we were about rock and roll and sex and drugs and, countercultural hippiedom, but, we were just a little too Birkenstock to get anything done. I think that there's a real tendency to forget that we stopped a war, thank you very much. And we were showing up en masse to ban the bomb. Do you realize the United States has over 7,000 nuclear bombs in our arsenal? Over 7,000. Now, the world would have been destroyed. You lob 4 or 5 of those. It's over for the majority of the population of the world. And so today, we should be out doing that. But I also think that walking through the halls of Congress today is the equivalent of walking in the streets was then. We gotta march somewhere, though. That's very clear.
And we seem to have lost that collective marching.
Well, we were easily co-opted, and I know for those of us who are Americans, and you certainly are now, but for those of us who were Americans back in the 60s and the 70s, the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and I think very much and very significantly the students at Kent State, they gave a very loud, unspoken message. And that message was there will be no further protest. You will do whatever you want to do in the private sphere because we want you to expand those markets, but you will leave the public sector to whoever wants it so bad that they are willing to kill to control it. And those bullets psychically shot an entire generation. And they carried a message, be quiet now, or we might kill you too. And I think we did as we were told. Don't you, Ed? I mean, I think that we basically...
I really do, but I keep seeing Sean Corn's face and how she was doing, Occupy Wall Street, and Robert Thurman, and people that are absolutely gorgeous people who really are trying to get out
She's
there.
a different generation, though. Sean is younger than us. And Sean comes from that younger generation, which is now trying to save the world so that she can inhabit it. You and I, many of us come from a generation where it's a different dynamic. We remember a time when politics and spirituality and philosophy were part of the same container. We became quiet. And I think that there's tremendous social potential in the fact that we're thinking now about what it's going to be like on the day we die. And I think many of us are actually more afraid of knowing on the last day we have on this earth. It's actually scarier to us, the thought that we might die in our hearts knowing we didn't do what we came here to do, than is the thought that they might kill us if we do. So if you take the political emphasis, the magnificence, that life-producing vigor of the Sean Corns and those younger than her as well, and then you marry that with those of us who have more memories than we have future, but we have the will and the absolute commitment to getting it done while we're here. If we marry those two, we can get this thing done, and we can turn this thing around while we're alive.
And I think that's a beautiful point, that in a way, what you're talking about now, that, walking through the halls of government is actually the same thing as marching against the bomb. That sense of being engaged, that sense of feeling that we can actually make a difference, however we do it, is a huge uplift for people. It's hugely empowering.
And I think sometimes those of us in the spiritual community think of politics as this weird other world, and so don't even consider it. I think a lot of people want to participate, want to be active, but don't even see politics as a valid container for the best impulses among us anymore, which is to some extent true. And a lot of the most important work is going on non-governmental agencies. But you still can't, when you look at the tremendous financial and political resources that are wielded by government, we simply can't really take seriously the notion that it is our task and our duty and our mission to bring light unto the world and ignore a corner that is as dark as that one.
I think some of the things that have happened with the spiritual people, especially all those old hippies you were talking about who have gone to India, because a lot of the Eastern teachers said spiritual people don't get into politics, don't get into that whole unconscious realm. I don't quite even understand why. It makes it feel like it's dirty water and you got to stay clean, pure, and whatever not.
Well, it's more of an Eastern tradition than a Western tradition. But the fact is, we're Westerners, and I feel strongly that we need to honor our incarnation. No matter what where you were born, what your ethnicity, what your culture, what your original religion, your sex, your sexuality, there's some message here about your own dharma this lifetime. And the gifts of the East and the West, it's a yin and a yang. Neither one is better or worse than the other. But the passion of the West and the power of the West has to do with the notion that we can change what we don't like. And that is the gift of the Western mind. And, a lot of the genius of the East, while it has certainly brought about many, many facets of enlightenment, it has also produced cultures in which there is, to the Western mind, an acquiescence, for instance, to forces of major poverty that is not us at our best. We don't look at that millions and millions and millions of people starving in the street and go, oh, that's okay. The gift of the West is to say, well, we can fix that. Our characterological strength is you give us a to-do list and we can figure out how to do that. So if you marry the gifts of the Eastern tradition spiritually with the vigor of the Western tradition attitudinally and materially, when we put those two together, that's when we have the height of consciousness and the synergy with which we will not only imagine and embrace in our hearts the idea of a more perfect world, but we will actually help to create it on the material plane in which we live.
And it has to be, and that's why we need people who are governing to care about all the people, not someone who's in power that doesn't even know how much a container of milk costs or what it costs to get on a subway, or someone who's totally disconnected from people.
Well, one would think, certainly who wouldn't see 47% of the American people as losers, right?
I know. So one of the other, you were talking about the East and West, and I just wanted to touch in on one of the other differences that I've always found fascinating, is that in the East, women are considered to be the wisdom quality and men the compassion quality, whereas in the West, it's usually the exact opposite, that men take wisdom and women take compassion.
Explain how the hands, when they sort of have the hands in prayer position.
Well, that's the Tibetan Buddhist. That's a little different. This is more about, with the Tibetan Buddhists, they consider the heart is the mind. And I love that. So when they're bowing with the mind is being the body, and the mouth as being the voice, and the heart as being the mind. And it's just this shift of emphasis of owning our own wisdom, or women owning their own wisdom, and recognizing that it's really the heart that's the leader here.
Yes, but now look at the state of American women in the Western world versus the state of women. A lot of times people just love talking about the goddess, but they have a hard time with actual women.
Yeah.
And so if you actually look at the state of women, in the Western world, for the most part, we are not huge masses of suppressed women the way they are in certain Eastern cultures. So when you look, and I think that's the point here, you can look at great wisdom traditions that are ancient from certain parts of the world and see something very extraordinary. But the West, I think, has a lot to be proud of, and I think the East sometimes has some things to look at when it comes to how women and girls are actually treated.
But we're coming towards the end, so I really want you to talk more about Sister Giant event. Let's hear more about as much as you can in the last 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much. On November 10th and 11th in Los Angeles, people are gathering, women, but men are absolutely invited as well. People are gathering from all over the United States, and to some extent we have people coming from Canada, from Germany, from Australia. It's interesting to see some of the international people who will be here as well. But the conversation will center on the marriage of consciousness and politics, the idea that we could create a new political conversation in which love rather than economics is our bottom line. And we will be centering on three main political issues, because I think that taking any more than that for the weekend will just be too much. We are going to deal with the 23.1% child poverty rate. We're going to deal with Citizens United and the direct threat to democracy that represents, feeding into the move to amend the Constitution so that it will be permanently established that corporations do not have the rights of personhood. We will also be dealing with the high incarceration rate in the United States. So we will be talking about the psychological and emotional issues that are involved in having a political conversation that is not the old, mean, toxic dynamics, but something where we are actually standing on what we want, not fighting what is, but really standing on that which we wish to see in the world. And
will
then
there be speakers?
Absolutely. Adam Winkler from UCLA will be our speaker on Citizens United. Author Lisa Bloom will be our speaker on high incarceration. Charlene Spretnak will be our speaker on the relational model by which women think differently and lead differently. All of Sunday, the speakers will be from the Women's Campaign School of Yale University, really talking to women about what if you were to decide to run for office? What does that entail? How does one do it? So that, like I said, everybody will leave there not only having had the spiritual conversation, mainly moderated by me, but also with other people talking about what the actual political issues are to marry to that. And Saturday night, we will have speakers from the Democrats, the Republicans, the Libertarians, the Greens, and the Justice Party, so that they'll be saying, if you were running for office, we think you should run on this party. And I think it'll be a pretty exciting conversation, because everybody will be saying, why? and asking questions. So I think it's going to be a very fun weekend. I think it's going to be meaningful. I think it's going to be significant, but I also think it's going to be very exciting. It's kind of like this conclave. We're all getting together.
Can you connect? How do you connect a live stream?
Well, if people go to the website, sistergiant.com, and you look under the registration nav, you will see that one of the things that you get on the Eventbrite page is the live streaming, and we're asking for a suggested donation of $35 for the live stream.
And why did you call it Sister Giant? What inspired
I don't know. I did a Sister Giant. I did a Sister Giant conference a couple of years ago. It was called Sister Giant, Awaking the Sleeping Giant of American Womanhood. And so I just thought that phrase was powerful. I like the idea. It says to me, big women, Sister Giant. It's time for us to be big. I'm sorry?
It's like sometimes people think women are little and men are big, so it's like that Sister Giant.
Yeah, it's the end of Little Women, although I do love that book. But if you see the picture there on the website, we took an old etching of Betsy Ross with women helping her sew the first flag, right? But in this one of the women is dark-skinned. She has an iPod. The other woman has pink hair and fancy high heels, and she's nursing a baby. And Betsy Ross has a peace symbol around her neck and geek chic glasses. So the whole idea of it's coming around again. The spiral comes around again, and it's a new mothering of a new America.
So you're going to have to come back after Sister Giant. We're going to have you, Deb, and I, my English wonderful guru, whose father with another other than Winston Churchill connected and royalty beyond that, and me from the Bronx, come together with the beloved Marianne, because the show is coming to an end, and I can go on all night. You are the most inspiring, beautiful, exquisite woman in the whole world, next to Deb, but in the whole
Marianne,
world.
Thank you so much. We are coming right to an end now, and I just want to really thank you and encourage everybody to go. If you can't get to LA for Sister Giant, then do stream it and listen to it, and online, sistergiant.com.
And I just want to say we're doing a meditation conference, and we'd love you to be part of it. Sean Corners, I'd love you to be.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Marianne.
I love you guys.
Absolutely.
You're just the best. Thank you for what you do for all of us. God bless.
Thank you.
You're a
Bye.
joy.
Bye.
Bye.
Blog Talk Radio, where millions of hosts and listeners gather. Blog Talk Radio, the world's largest online radio network.
And this is Ed Shapiro.
On Going Out of Your Mind.
And we all need to go out of our mind at least once a day.
And then we'll maybe be able to come to our senses. Today's guest is Marianne Williamson, who we adore, and as I'm sure many of you do too. She's been a leading light for those seeking greater awareness for many, many years. 4 of her 10 books have been #1 New York Times bestsellers, and published over 20 years ago. Her book, A Return to Love, is considered a must-read by millions of people.
And it's so perfect. It's so perfect. A book like Return to Love. And Marianne, explain to us.
She's going to be here and just joining us in 1 second. She's deeply committed to both spiritual practice and to spiritual activism. And Marianne is now bringing an essential awareness, especially at this time, to the need to bring together consciousness and politics. And this is a subject often considered taboo in spiritual circles. So we're hoping and welcoming Marianne will be able to explain this for us. Welcome, Marianne. Hello? Oh, no, Marianne.
She's here. I know she's here.
Well, surely she's here. No, it doesn't look like she is.
but I guess she's going to be here any second.
We're just waiting for her to come online.
But it's important for us to say how she affects us. We've done a couple of books with Marianne Williamson. We did a book called Voices from the Heart with President Gorbachev, with Bishop Tutu, with some of the great thinkers, and she's here now.
Okay. Hi, is this Marianne?
Yes, it is. Oh,
hi there. Hi.
I'm so sorry. I had called and you couldn't hear me and I could hear you, and I think I pushed the wrong button, so I'm so sorry.
That's quite okay.
But that's understandable because I know that we're on other sides of the world. That's how amazing it is.
Where are you,
actually? We can talk to each other like this and come together in love.
Right. Where are you guys?
We're in Colorado, near Aspen.
Well, I'm in Los Angeles. It's not exactly the other side of the world, but
it's close. A different universe.
Well, I say that because when we come together like this, it feels very far away, but yet so close.
Right.
So, Marianne, I was just introducing you, and particularly how consciousness and politics, it's a subject, a combination that's often considered taboo in spiritual circles.
Right. Well,
but you've crossed that line. Tell us about it.
Well, to me, there's not a line. In many religious traditions, tonight is the beginning of Yom Kippur, for instance. In Judaism, the notion of tikkun olam, to repair the world, that is part of our spiritual mission. And in Protestantism and Catholicism, there are many religious traditions where the idea of social justice activism is very much core to the religious traditions. That's actually true in Islam as well. In the higher consciousness movement, the spiritual movement that you and I, many of us, have been involved in the last few years, it is true that it developed in a very apolitical way. A little strange to me, because when my career first started, from the very beginning, I was very involved in the AIDS community, mainly because gay men in Los Angeles pretty much gave me my career. So I was not only...
You were
yes, and then she actually was very active when the suffering began and when the crisis emerged. I remember that. But so for me, human suffering was up close and personal as part of the work and the spiritual practice from the beginning. But then as things moved forward in the New Thought movement, et cetera, it was very apolitical and even used what seems to me a kind of ersatz version of spirituality, almost a counterfeit version of enlightenment, as it were, to give oneself a path, to say, well, because the spiritual realm is a realm of abstraction, and the mortal realm is a realm of illusion anyway, we best not be involved. And politics is so toxic and so dirty and so angry, and on a spiritual path, that's everything we're trying to get away from. Well, the problem there is but that puts you in a real conundrum, of course, because spirituality is a path of the heart. It's a path of love. And if you're on a path of love, you cannot turn away from a suffering child. You cannot turn away from a starving person. You can't turn away from suffering. Suffering of all sentient beings, compassion for the suffering of all sentient beings is absolutely core to any higher religious teaching. So I understand why sometimes we turn away from anything that is toxic and corrupt in the world. But in some areas of darkness in the world, our point is to engage it, because what you don't engage, you can't transform. And that which we engage from a higher place, we ultimately help to transform forever.
I had a teacher who used to say it's like turning shit into gold.
Well, that's certainly one way to put it.
But Marianne, why now? You in November, you're doing this wonderful event in LA called Sister Giant.
Sister Giant.
And your whole purpose right now is this coming together and bringing consciousness into politics, and also encouraging women to be more involved. Why now?
Well, I think why now, because the red lights are absolutely blinking. The buzzers are sounding. The probability vectors for the next 20 years are extraordinarily grim. not just in our country, but around the world. Here in the United States, we have a 23.1% child poverty rate, which among 35 developed nations in the world, our child poverty rate is second only to Romania. We have an incarceration rate in the United States, which is not only higher than any other country, but the highest in the world in history. And we have what I believe are direct threats to democracy, such as the Citizens United Supreme Court decision that has basically given permission to corporate as well as union interests to give anonymous, unlimited donations towards political advocacy. So I think that people who are involved in the spirituality and higher consciousness movement are the last people who should be sitting this out. We have unique gifts to give. We have unique contributions to make because we understand the kind of rethinking that is necessary. We understand the kind of return to first principles that is necessary in order to bring an individual life out of crisis and back into regrowth, and all that a nation is a collection of individuals.
But it's so insane that they should say that corporations are people, and there has to be something that cuts through. I mean, the beauty and the exquisiteness of who you are and other women, you know, like Oprah Winfrey that I know you work with, and I know you even have worked with Elizabeth Taylor. So many amazing people who know that this is a time we need to bring in the feminine. We need to bring in what the whole consciousness, the goddess consciousness, because I think it feels like women seem to have much more going for themselves than men. We need to come together at this time. Why don't you run for office? Why I mean, I hope I'm not saying the wrong thing, but with your brain, with, you know, everyone should have a brain like you and would have a real world.
Well,
would you consider that?
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I think what I'm feeling moved to do right now is, you know, everything begins with a conversation, as you well know, and you yourselves are leaders in this. We need a new conversation in the United States in order to awaken some energy so that we're not just dealing with these forces that are always pulling us down into